what does it mean to be a composer? To many artists and the general public, the term can have negative or outdated connotations, possibly conjuring up images of dead old white guys in powdered wigs. Composition, as defined by Andrew Hugel, literally means putting things together, which can apply to many different disciplines. In music, the field of composition has evolved dramatically in recent years, giving composers entirely new opportunities to put things together in brand new practices. One of the most exciting of these is video game music, as the industry continues to see tremendous growth and developments every year, and the practice itself posing completely unique opportunities and challenges for composers and artists in general. This video explains my journey as a composer of exploring video game music as an unfamiliar practice. To do this, I use research from the context of video game music and case study analysis of video game music to then inform my composition of original video game music. Sorry, I'll be saying video game music a lot, I can't really get around it. All this is then filtered through my own experience and self-reflection as a lens through which to explore musical identity and how I situate myself in this unfamiliar practice, if that makes sense. So, I'd like to note that this is not intended to be a guidebook or a tutorial in any sense of how to compose music for video games or how to be a composer or anything like that, but more of an exploration into things like development, self-reflection and identity by using composing music for video games as a kind of meta case study. For a bit of background, my name's Harry and I compose, perform and release music under the name Harry Bongo. I'm a huge fan of video games and I have been for basically my whole life. I've always been really interested in their soundtracks especially, but I've never actually tried to write video game music myself. So I thought this project would be a great opportunity to explore how I might go about doing this for the first time. The medium of video games has seen an incredible evolution since only beginning around half a century ago. Not only has the technology greatly improved, but video games are now being recognised as not just for casual fun entertainment, but as legitimate art forms too. The BAFTA Game Awards are just one example of this. From what started out as a limited aesthetic based on the capability of console hardware, video game music has evolved and expanded to pretty much every conceivable aesthetic, from epic orchestral scores to in-game campfire folk songs. And because of this, Rod Munday argued that there is no longer any such thing as video game music. Instead, he motioned towards a description of music that has been written for or adapted to video games, as there's no longer the stylistic benchmarks prevalent today in chiptune music, for example. When starting out my research in this field, one of the first and most important sources I came across was Composing Music for Games by Chance Thomas, which he describes as a guidebook for launching and maintaining a successful career as a video game composer, and I would thoroughly recommend it as a starting point if you're looking to break into this practice. So in this book, Thomas outlined the timeless principles of music scoring as he saw them, which are setting the mood, heightening emotion, propelling the action, providing contextual clues, enhancing the aesthetic, and contributing to structural unity. In addition to these, he also outlines the principles of music scoring unique to video games being flexibility, scale, and function. Now, in this definition of function, Thomas is referring to functional music outside of the game's dramatic content, like menu themes, for example. However, in addition to this definition, I generally saw function as being everything inherent to how music physically functions in the game. Flexibility is probably the most important of these functions. Because video games rely on player input, the unpredictability of events poses a challenge for composers more used to writing linearly. Therefore, an adaptive approach for music composition is crucial. Different layering and branching techniques, as are known, can be used in this case. For example, Thomas outlines a system of using musical blocks, like this one here, consisting of intro, loop, transition, and tag blocks. These blocks can be transitioned into one another based on player input and the events in the game. For example, Thomas's book goes into these technical concepts in much more detail, so I won't be covering them too much here. I'm just introducing them for a bit of context. Scale is also directly linked to flexibility, as Thomas points out that there needs to be enough musical coverage to last for an unknowable amount of time, which can increase greatly if we consider big budget, large scale AAA games, which might have a long story and a big world to explore. Jorgensen also argued that video game music, and audio in general, exists for more than merely ornamental purposes, and can provide valuable information about specific situations and settings as audio clues. Above all, composers must consider the experience of the player when writing music for games. People can develop incredible bonds with games for different reasons. Video games can provide a high level of immersion through multi-sensory input and a feeling of transportation, a sense of escapism in fantasy worlds, for instance. The control that players have over video games in their choices and actions adds another dimension of emotional connection, particularly in single-player narrative-based games, where the player can become completely immersed and involved in the game's story and character arcs. There's also a strong link of nostalgia associated with video games, and because of this, people can have strong emotional connections to games they played in their childhood. If you go to pretty much any YouTube video of video game music, it's highly likely that you'll find people saying how much they love the music, and they're usually reminiscing about their younger years. In relation to this, releasing a soundtrack or score as a unique product can help give the composer or composers greater acknowledgement for their work, added revenue, and exposure as individual artists. However, in considering this, it raised further questions for me about identity and collaboration. Self-reflection is incredibly important in defining identity because, in my opinion, a lot of it comes down to how you see yourself. In contrast to Western classical music, contemporary popular music blurs the line between composer and performer, often merging them into the term artist. However, there are of course composers who describe themselves as such, yet do not release music under their own name, dedicating themselves entirely to writing music for creative projects. Of course, the roles and identities of composers has changed a lot due to technological advancements, where composers are producing music digitally, often blurring the line between music and sound design and possibly distancing themselves from the pen and paper image of the composer. Personally, I also find that there is often too much focus put on the composer as an individual, as Stillinger called the myth of solitary genius, which can diminish the work of and credit given to other collaborators. This is not to say that art should be treated as faceless, uninteresting content creators or machines. I do still believe that there is great importance in recognising particular artists for their sole creative output, as long as the right people are being acknowledged, in my view. In addition to researching the context of video game music, I used my experience of playing 4 different games as a lens to analyse how music functions in the game, its aesthetic, the player experience, and the identity of the composer or composers. The games I chose to analyse were The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, Celeste, Red Dead Redemption 2, and Outer Wilds. I chose these games in particular because of the variety of genre and style to give me a better overview of different approaches to video game music. Also, these were all games I'd played before and had a great emotional connection to, which would allow for a more personal reflection and generally just because I love them. In analysing these games as case studies, I aimed to gain further knowledge to inform how I would go about composing original video game music. Rather than detailing my entire analysis for each game, I'll just be summarising some of the key points I found. Breath of the Wild and Red Dead 2, both being open world games, use similar techniques in their soundtracks. During idle open world exploration states, both games use short musical fragments to punctuate the natural ambience. This not only alleviates issues tied to flexibility and scale for the composer, but also makes for a more immersive yet peaceful experience for the player. Having repetitive, heroic or epic music will get tiresome pretty quickly when exploring such a rich, detailed landscape at your own pace. Hundreds of hours can be spent in these worlds, so avoiding fatigue is crucial. In Celeste, composer Lena Raine considers flexibility and adaptiveness very well in her soundtrack. Layering is used in her arrangements to add to or subtract from looping underscore themes at different stages in each level, which can also function as audio clues, signifying important developments in the narrative. This is also significant in Celeste because it helps to make the very difficult gameplay more forgiving, considering the amount of times players will die in-game and need to restart at the beginning of the screen, so having dynamic themes makes for a much more positive experience. Outer Wilds interweaves diegetic and non-diegetic music to create many audio clues for the player in aiding their discovery and exploration. Without revealing too much to avoid spoilers, composer Andrew Prallo uses musical cues to alert the player when they have successfully solved a puzzle, discovered an important location, or during important events in the game's narrative. However, music and sounds are also used within the game's world for the signal scope, a device used by the playable character to track and follow important audio signals. I could talk about each of these fantastic games for hours, but the discussions here lead us on to the actual production commentary, starting with my self-reflection. An important step in understanding how I can enter an unfamiliar practice such as this is by examining my experience in similar areas, particularly my musical style and characteristics. So far, my musical output has mostly consisted of releasing music under the Harry Bongo alias, as well as composing music for short films, video installations, trailers, show reels, and other similar forms of video media. Because of this, I tend to describe myself mainly as a composer and recording artist, and producer as well sometimes. Still don't really know what to go with. I would say the music I write has inherent cinematic qualities. By this I mean I put a lot of considerations into things like theme, setting, story, concept, drama, and most importantly emotion, achieved through primarily instrumental music. Using the opening track Beacon of my album Igloo as an example, I aim to capture the setting and emotions of wandering lost through a dark snowstorm. I achieve this in a literal sense, firstly through the use of sounds of radio tuning and transmission sounds, along with the light piano SOS Morse code message to establish the feeling of desperation and isolation of walking through the wilderness, helping to emphasise the concept of home present throughout the album Igloo. In terms of sonic qualities, the music I make can largely be described as electroacoustic with ambient sensibilities. I use a lot of organic sounds such as acoustic stringed instruments, pianos, and percussion instruments, blended with synthetic textures, often involving sampling and reshaping these acoustic sounds. I tend to favour an intricate, characteristic production made for what is known as headphone listening over music made for the radio or club environments, for example. I'm still constantly reflecting upon my musical identity, and for me it was a long process of trying out different things before I arrived at a point where I understood the things I was best at and enjoyed doing the most. When I was younger, I was a bit more interested in being able to be okay at writing a lot of different things in different styles. And it took me a few years to understand that it's fine and probably better to have a more defined musical style. Of course, I know it's all very well me saying, like, for example, don't put yourself forward for projects if it's not really your style. I totally get that. I'm not trying to say if you're struggling to find work as a composer, I'm not trying to be like that at all. But I'm more just kind of talking about being aware of what you can do well, what you're best at, what you enjoy the most, which may also help with finding work if people know what you're good at and they can kind of, they know to come to you for that sort of thing. The point of me saying all this isn't just for self-indulgence, I promise. It's to share my process of analysing my work and identity overall, to then look at how I would take it forward in creating new things. But thanks for bearing with me nonetheless. So at first, my idea was to actually compose and produce an original soundtrack for a real developing video game. I tried contacting some developers, but nothing suitable was found. After this, I realised it would actually make more sense for me to reflect upon my experience of becoming more familiar with this practice and composing music based on that, rather than having to deliver an actual portfolio of video game music for real collaborators and clients. And it would be unfair to ask them to deal with someone not as experienced in this field. And this approach also gave me more freedom to experiment with different types of games, for example. Moving on to the composition side of things, I decided on 4 different games to write music for: Roki, Death Stranding, Season, and Mint of Islands. The choice of these games was informed by gaming publications, gaming communities, and my own preference based on my compositional style. By this, I mean I chose these particular games over others because they felt, to me at least, more alike to my style of music making, which favours a more textural, ambient arrangement over big orchestral scores, for example. These games were in different stages of development. Roki and Death Stranding had already been released by the time I started this project in late 2020. Mint of Islands had only just been released back in June this year, and Season is still in development with no confirmed release date. I thought this would give me a good, diverse range of information and media to work with, as a kind of challenge for myself, in that composers are often involved from the very early stages of development of games and media projects in general, or they can also be contacted very late in development. One of the most important things to me when writing music for these games was avoiding any kind of bias or influence on the game's soundtrack, so that I could work with a completely blank canvas. To do this, I mainly watched gameplay footage and trailers with the sound muted, and made sure that I would only be scoring music for games that I'd never played or even experienced before, say for example on a live stream. So from learning the importance of flexibility and non-linearity in video games music, I considered my best approach using the experience and resources I had. Given that most DAWs work in a linear time-based format, as does most music in general, it would be challenging to work in this way and try to move away from these conventions considering the medium. After experimenting with different strategies, I found that using Ableton Live Session View allowed me to compose, produce and arrange music in a non-linear fashion quite well. This allowed me to trigger musical clips at my own discretion and get a feel for working non-linearly much better, as it's laid out in a vertical fashion rather than horizontal. And having looped clips of varying length allowed for a more dynamic soundtrack, which wouldn't sound repetitive as it would loop at different times, and the kind of start and ends would be at different times and all that. I also took advantage of probability tools and sequencers, both software and hardware, like for example on the Electron Model Cycles and the Arturia BeatStep Pro, to add more unpredictability or subtract probability, to help me make the music a bit more lively and evolving. Now, to be clear, I didn't want to go too far into game audio implementation, so this method was the closest I could find to this process without learning new software like Fmod or Unity, although this is definitely something I've considered doing in the future. Also, by using Ableton's Push-2 controller, I had much more of a tactile control over the music, and it generally just made it a lot more fun to do. I'm not being sponsored or anything, like you imagine. I'm just being honest. The same could be applied for any kind of MIDI controller. Anything that you can map buttons to, or sliders and faders and whatnot. Anything that kind of takes away from using mouse and keyboard a bit more, it generally just makes it a lot more fun, and it makes you feel like you're actually writing and producing music like an instrument. Also, it's worth noting, I did consider scoring directly to gameplay footage or something like that, but then I realised that that kind of eliminates the point of working non-linearly if I just end up scoring to picture anyway, like I would a film or video. So in the games themselves, I used what I'd learned about the function of music in games, aesthetic, player experience and composer identity from my contextual research and my case studies filtered through self-reflection to inform my original music composition. Like with the case studies, I'll just talk about some notable highlights rather than going into detail in my entire process. I drew a lot of inspiration from how music functioned in open world games like Breath of the Wild and Red Dead 2, like using short musical fragments to enhance and punctuate the game's ambience without being too distracting for the player. For Death Stranding's combat music, I took inspiration from Breath of the Wild's demonstration of the same scenario, where they use different intensity levels depending on how long the fight goes on for and how aggressive it is. Here, I took advantage of scenes in Ableton Live session view to trigger a whole row of clips at once relating to each intensity level. Often, instead of having unique transition music, going back to Chance Thomas's music block system, game soundtracks will often simply crossfade between different musical cues, depending on environments and events within the game, which was also common in my case studies. I used this technique most notably in Roki, where I wrote different themes for both indoor and outdoor areas, and used the crossfade tool in Ableton Live to smoothly transition between them, which again felt more natural for me to do, especially when using a MIDI controlled fader, as it was drawn from my own experience of being an electronic artist and being a DJ as well. So, in conclusion, there's definitely not one exact way to explore a new practice like this, but by taking a self-reflective approach to studying video game music practice, I was able to reflect upon my past experience and these new experiences to gain a better understanding of how I would situate myself within this field. I'm in no way trying to say I'm an expert in the subject, or that I'm an expert in anything really, but I hope in sharing my experience I've opened up some discussions and helped people consider their process and development a bit more. Examining my own identity and what this means generally helped me understand what I do a lot better and what I can bring to this new practice. I would encourage anyone who is maybe a bit lost with understanding unfamiliar practices to reflect upon their own practice experience and understand who you are a bit better. Now, even though I'm referencing stuff like Ableton and all the other products that I mentioned, I'm definitely not saying that you need these things in order to write video game music or any kind of music. The point I'm trying to make is about using what you can do and what you already have at your disposal to take with you into new experiences and practices. So that's about it. I would really love to hear what you think about this video and my research. If you've got anything to add, if you agree or disagree with anything I've said, please leave a comment or send me a message. The more discussion, the better. And if you want to read the full essay from which this video was derived from, or you want to hear full versions of the music I made, just let me know and I can send stuff over to you. And if you liked anything I've made here or presented here, want to see my other work, feel free to subscribe or check out the links in the description to follow me elsewhere. This is the first time I've done something like this, so thank you so much for watching, especially for making it to the end of my rambling. So, bye bye.